The other night, I was sitting across from a friend, let's call him Leo, and he was just aggressively swiping through a dating app. He's 27, and he was practically vibrating with this intense, almost desperate energy. He kept showing me profiles, his eyes wide, saying things like, I just want someone to get coffee with, you know, someone who actually gets it.
Right, the search for that real connection.
Exactly. He sounded like a man on a mission. And honestly, it lines up with the latest data showing nearly 86% of young men are now actively craving that. To hear him tell it, he was ready to settle down tomorrow.
But then
his phone actually buzzed. A match. A real person sent a message asking if he wanted to meet up this weekend. And just like that, the whole energy in the room just shifted.
Oh, I think I know where this is going.
It wasn't excitement anymore. It was this sudden, visible recoil. He stared at the screen for a long beat, and his expression went from giddy anticipation to this kind of weary suspicion. Then he slowly turned his phone face down on the table. And he says, his voice dropping into this calm, almost detached tone, actually, I think I'm just going to stay in and finish that series I started. I don't really have the headspace for the complications right now.
The complications, that's the key word.
It was a perfect, real-world demonstration of what sociologists are now calling paperclip emotion. This strange, modern loop where you see people stretching themselves out, reaching for intimacy with everything they've got, only to curve right back to the exact same starting point total solitude.
Just like a paperclip.
Exactly. The path looks like it's going somewhere new, but it's designed to return to the center.
And what's fascinating, and what you pointed out, is that this isn't just playing hard to get. It's something much deeper.
It's a calculated psychological tug of war. For women, this loop is often framed as a joyful choice, a path toward self-growth, avoiding the exhaustion of low-quality relationships. But for everyone, it creates this bizarre paradox.
A generation that is lonelier than ever.
Yet more protective of their single status than any that came before. They are caught in this constant oscillation between the hunger for a soulmate and the absolute terror of losing their self.
And that tension, that exact description of Leo, is precisely why we need this deep dive. That oscillation between intense craving and sudden terror is the paperclip emotion paradox.
Okay.
So our mission today is to really get into the weeds, to thoroughly examine the sociological and technological forces that are driving this bizarre loop.
Right. Where does this come from?
We need to understand why a generation that so intensely craves this profound, authentic connection is at the same time showing this deep fear of vulnerability, this terror of truly committing or losing your identity within a relationship.
It feels like a fundamental contradiction.
It is. So we're going to look at how decades of social change, the pressures of the modern competitive market, and the infiltration of technology into our most private moments have transformed the search for love from an emotional adventure into an exhausting, high-stakes transaction.
Okay. Let's unpack this. When you look at someone like Leo, who's clearly just overwhelmed by the prospect of intimacy, it makes you wonder what certainty we've lost. If today's landscape is all instability, we have to look back at what provided stability in the first place.
That's the perfect starting point.
So that means starting with the massive historical shift that moved us from an era of, I guess, romantic certainty to one of radical choice.
That's precisely where we have to begin, with the historical foundation. When a sociologist like Eva Illouz studies the history of romance, she emphasizes that traditionally love was not a free market phenomenon. It was highly regulated.
Regulated how? Like by the government?
Not government, but by a social structure. Pre-modern intimate life was governed by these rigid social scripts, the power structures of religious patriarchy, gender inequality, and maybe most importantly, fixed economic alliances.
So when people get nostalgic about the certainty of the past, they're not talking about emotional certainty like, I'm sure this person is my soulmate.
No, not at all.
They're talking about social and structural certainty.
Exactly. The framework of courtship was incredibly clear. It was a highly ritualized process that signaled one thing: intent toward matrimony. And matrimony was, fundamentally, an economic merger, or a way to consolidate religious or family power.
So courtship was basically a series of social and economic vetoes.
It was. And it resulted in a binary, definitive outcome. You either got married, or you got a definitive, socially recognized rejection. There was no gray area.
Elaine de Botton talks about this, right? The pre-modern reasons for marriage, it was almost like a business merger.
It was overwhelmingly pragmatic. People married because their families owned adjacent parcels of land that needed to be consolidated for farming.
Right.
or because the union would secure a crucial business alliance in the city, maybe a textile operation, or, less tangibly but just as powerfully, they married because both families shared the same interpretation of a holy text or belonged to the same tiny social circle. Love was a fortunate byproduct, but it was never the prerequisite.
And I imagine that while that sounds emotionally, difficult and probably led to its own kind of misery, like loneliness inside a marriage, it did create an ironclad structure. You knew the rules. You knew your place.
The certainty was in the commitment itself, which was enforced by the entire community, by religious dogma. Structural security was everything. The destabilization, the shift away from that, began subtly. It was a move from this structured world to one obsessed with emotion.
Where do you pinpoint that change?
We can trace the first major cultural tremor to the Sturm und Drang movement in Germany, which was roughly 1765 to 1785.
That feels like a huge leap from merging land parcels to romantic self-destruction. What made that era so explosive?
It was a massive intellectual and artistic revolt against Enlightenment rationalism, against the strict societal norms of the day. It privileged intense, highly subjective, and often irrational emotion over the dry, measured, and fixed social structures.
And the key text for that was Goethe, right?
The literary example that just encapsulated this massive shift was Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther.
Oh, Werther, the blueprint for every romantic tragedy since.
Absolutely. The protagonist, Werther, is defined by his passionate, unrestrained, and ultimately unrequited love for Lotte. He pursues this passion purely based on his individual feeling, completely disregarding the social impossibility of their union. She's engaged to someone else.
It doesn't matter to him.
Not at all. His emotional intensity is so extreme that when his desires are thwarted by reality, he sees no solution but despair and suicide. This story, when it was published in 1774, was a devastating critique of emotional repression. It signaled that individual, internal, irrational feeling could and maybe should take precedence over external social rules.
So the idea that true love is this intense, singular, almost religious experience that has to supersede all common sense and structure, that's actually a pretty recent invention.
It is.
It's like an idealism that previously might have been directed at God or some spiritual quest, but it got rerouted entirely toward another human being.
Yes, and this emphasis on radical individual emotion was just amplified exponentially in the 20th century, especially as these massive societal forces converged. First, you have urbanization.
Right, people moving to cities.
It changed the literal geography of dating. People moved from these fixed, restrictive rural communities to anonymous, bustling cities, which massively increased the sheer number of available partners and opportunities to meet.
More options, less oversight.
Precisely. And at the same time, you have the rise of science and, crucially, Freudian psychoanalysis, which began to demoralize sexuality.
How so?
Sex was increasingly seen as a natural, essential drive. A form of recreation, even. It was no longer an act that was inherently tied to sin or procreation only within the confines of marriage. This erosion of rigid religious and social frameworks created new freedoms, but also profound new instability.
And this is where we start seeing that cultural archetype emerge in literature, right? The hedonist single man who's all about personal pleasure and freedom over commitment.
The early 20th century literature of Marcel Proust, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Henry Miller, it captures this perfectly. The bachelor who sees relationships as these transient opportunities for pleasure and self-discovery.
And this didn't go unnoticed by the sociologists of the time.
No, it didn't. Emile Durkheim, observing social trends at the turn of the century, he specifically remarked on the inherent instability this new freedom created for men.
His observation about the unmarried man is haunting because it seems so counterintuitive to how we think about freedom now.
It really is. Durkheim described the unmarried man as having the unrestricted right to form attachments wherever his inclination led him. He could aspire to everything, but he was satisfied with nothing.
Wow.
And Durkheim concluded that this boundless uncertainty condemned the individual to a constant state of disturbance, agitation, and discontent. The married man, whose desires were structurally restricted, had a firm mental foundation. The unrestricted single man, Durkheim warned, was destined for disturbance because he lacked the anchor of necessity.
But wait a minute. Isn't that a profoundly patriarchal perspective? It kind of suggests men need restriction to be happy. Did he even consider that maybe the restraint of marriage was the real cause of discontent for a lot of people?
That's a critical challenge to his framing, absolutely. He was observing social stability as it was structured at the time, not arguing for the emotional fulfillment of the individuals involved.
Oh, great.
His point was fundamentally structural. When those societal scripts are erased, the emotional burden of endless choice falls entirely on the individual. And that leads to what he called anomie, or normlessness. That burden of radical freedom is the anxiety we are still dealing with today.
And if that wasn't enough of an upheaval, the feminist revolution came along and just fundamentally altered the social structure for women, removing their structural and financial need for marriage, which had been the framework holding everything together for millennia.
Absolutely. The mid to late 20th century saw these pivotal shifts. Women gained improved access to higher education, legal reforms, criminalized marital rape, protections like Title IX ensured greater professional equality. But the real watershed moment,
The pill?
was the 1960 introduction of the birth control pill.
That's where sex and risk fully decoupled for women.
For the first time in history, women gained unprecedented control over their reproductive lives. This effectively decoupled sex from the almost certain risk of unwanted motherhood and the social ruin that came with it. It meant women were no longer structurally or reproductively obligated to enter or stay in an unhappy marriage just for financial or social protection.
And that's when the data starts showing this huge cultural adaptation.
The data is undeniable. Since the latter half of the 20th century, marriage rates across Western societies have just declined steadily. In the U.S., they've dropped by nearly 50% since 1972, and at the same time, single-parent households, cohabitation, they all became normalized.
And the divorce rates, which shot up so dramatically during that period, that was the institution trying to absorb the shock of women's newfound freedom, right?
That's exactly how economist Stevenson Wolfers analyzed it. They suggested that the skyrocketing divorce rates from the 70s through the early 2000s were precisely the system struggling to adapt. Marriages formed under the old rules, where the wife's role was rigidly defined by domesticity and financial reliance, they just couldn't withstand the new realities.
The new reality being that emotional satisfaction and personal fulfillment became the main reasons to stay.
Right. Women now had the financial and legal power to say, I am leaving this for my own happiness, something that was structurally impossible before.
So while divorce rates have since stabilized a bit, partly because fewer people marry and they marry later, the essential change is permanent. Marriage is now a choice, not a necessity.
It's a deeply personal project aligned with individual goals, not a community mandate.
So the trade-off is clear. We gained these invaluable assets, equality, autonomy, protection from oppressive structures, but we lost the structural certainty that governed relationships for centuries. That freedom sounds incredibly heavy, exactly as someone like Erich Fromm warned.
Fromm captured that tension beautifully. He argued that freedom, when you get it by dissolving fixed societal ties, brings independence and rationality, but it also makes a person isolated, and because of that, anxious and powerless.
The whole weight of defining, choosing, and sustaining love falls on your shoulders alone.
And that individualized, insecure experience of love is the necessary foundation upon which the modern paperclip emotion is built.
Which brings us squarely into part two. The modern minefield and the paperclip recoil itself. So if commitment is no longer a social alliance and is now all about maximizing emotional satisfaction, the pressure on individual partners must be immense.
The pressure is exponential and it's chronic. Eva emphasizes that the very emotionalization of marriage, turning it into this soulmate quest, paradoxically made it more unstable.
How so?
Because commitments are now guided entirely by internal subjective desires, not external necessities. They are inherently fragile. And this immediately introduces massive performance pressure.
When you say performance pressure, are we talking about sexual performance, emotional labor, or both?
Both. But it extends far beyond the bedroom. Partners are now constantly acting as performers, sexually and emotionally, under this constant nagging threat of being replaced. The market is perceived as infinite.
And the threat is that there's always someone else out there who would love me more, understand me better.
Or make me feel more sexually alive.
Exactly.
This instability necessitates permanent self-optimization, and it fuels this profound insecurity in the relationship.
So basically, modern dating is like being in a nonstop high-stakes job interview where your resume is just your emotional availability and your sexual history. That sounds utterly exhausting.
It is. And if you recognize that modern breakup is commonplace, that pretty much every adult has experienced a painful, long-term relationship failure, the rational response is to mitigate that vulnerability. You want to protect yourself.
And that leads directly to the paperclip recoil mechanism, that curving back into solitude, which you defined earlier as negative choice.
Precisely. Negative choice is the modern individual's calculated strategic attempt to preserve their autonomy and safeguard against the potential distress of a breakup. It covers all those non-committal arrangements. Hookups, one-night stands, friends with benefits.
Arrangements designed for minimal investment.
They're specifically designed for minimal involvement of the self, where emotional investment is strictly rationed, and the sexual act often becomes the main or even the only goal.
So if positive choice was the old search for a marriage based on love, negative choice is the intentional withdrawal from emotional entanglement, all in the name of self-realization and freedom.
It functions as this powerful anticipatory defense mechanism against the pain of the market. And look, while we recognize that casual sex represents massive progress in sexual liberation in its current market-driven form, it risks becoming this symbolic act of the hyper-autonomous person who just refuses to commit, refuses vulnerability.
They are circling the possibility at connection without ever truly attempting to land.
Yes.
But here is the bizarre paradox. We have achieved this radical sexual freedom, and we've adopted these negative choice arrangements to maximize pleasure, yet the statistical data shows that sexual activity is actually declining. Why does more freedom result in less intimacy?
That's the classic sociological problem of choice overload applied to romance. Thanks to urbanization, mobility, and critically the internet, we face an abundance of options. Conventional wisdom says this should be liberating, but Illouz argues it generates apathy and paralysis.
Because when you have infinite options, the perceived opportunity cost of choosing any single one becomes way too high.
Absolutely. The anticipation of regret over all the lost opportunities is paralyzing. Why settle for a good relationship when a potentially great or even perfect one is just a swipe away?
It makes it harder to commit.
The sheer perceived number of alternatives reduces the energy required to commit and the capacity to choose one partner definitively. We know this empirically. Research by Pronk and Dennison confirms that perceiving a greater number of alternatives significantly reduces relationship stability.
You're constantly adrift, scanning the horizon for the next ship.
And this fatigue translates directly to physical intimacy. The U.S. data shows that adults had sex around 60 times a year in the early 1990s. That fell sharply to roughly 50 times a year by the 2010s. That's a 15% drop over 2 decades, right at the peak of choice proliferation.
And the global trend is even more stark in places where the pressure to perform has reached a cultural fever pitch.
Look at Japan, for instance. The trend toward non-activity is pronounced. In 2015, 43% of singles aged 18-34 reported being virgins. That's a significant jump from 33% just a decade earlier.
Wow.
And the decline in sexual behavior is often mapped directly onto the decline in stable relationships, because that's where most regular sexual activity happens. If nearly 60% of U.S. adults under 35 live without a partner, the link between non-commitment and non-activity is unavoidable.
So the abundance of choice plus the emotional labor required actually makes deep investment less appealing because you feel like you have to keep your portfolio liquid for better prospects.
And this mindset is systematically reinforced by the adoption of free market neoliberal ideals into the romantic sphere. It effectively creates a competitive sexual marketplace.
That sounds incredibly clinical. What does it even mean to apply neoliberal ideals like competition and optimization to affection?
It means we internalize the idea that we are human capital that must be continually enhanced and marketed. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han notes that love and sex become activities that require optimization. We're pressured to manage our physical appearance, our professional success, our social brand, our sexual capital, because we're in permanent competition with every other body in the market.
The moment you open a dating app, you're judged according to market value.
And this market is ruthlessly gendered, which accelerates the exhaustion for many. Research by Illouz and others shows the criteria for sexual attractiveness differ profoundly. Women's sexual capital is primarily physical youth, slimness, beauty standards, and is highly ephemeral, declining quickly over time.
This creates immense pressure to peak early and compete constantly.
Whereas men's attractiveness is tied much more strongly to social status, financial stability, resources capital that tends to increase over time.
Right.
So this structural disparity gives older men an increasing advantage, allowing them to engage with a wider range of partners, often including much younger women. The result is a significant skew in the singlehood data for young adults. In the U.S., 63% of men under 30 are single, compared to just 34% of women in the same age bracket.
63%, that's a huge disparity.
The men are disproportionately available. The women are disproportionately selective.
And when you filter your entire self-worth through this competitive market lens, The emotional damage of rejection must take on a completely new gravity.
It becomes crushing. Rejection in this marketplace isn't just, they didn't like me. It's perceived as being categorized as lacking value. We can understand this through Pierre Bourdieu's concept of distinction. Sexual desirability gets equated with social status and inherent self-worth.
So if someone rejects you based on the market criteria, it's not a personal preference, it's a market judgment. It confirms your inadequacy.
Which leads to profound feelings of social alienation. When you look at someone's profile and immediately think they're out of my league, that's Bourdieu's distinction at play. You're recognizing their high social currency.
And if you, like Leo, choose to step out of that competition entirely, you're often denied participation in what you call the last great narrative love.
And that strategic retreat, whether it's driven by fatigue or disenfranchisement, creates a different kind of alienation. On one extreme, you have the rise of communities like incels, who internalize this market rejection and externalize the blame, often targeting women for gaining agency in the market.
They see their inability to participate as a loss of power.
But the fatigue and pressure aren't just limited to men or those struggling. You mentioned women are also uniquely vulnerable in this sexually liberal, non-committal market.
How so?
Because despite all the progress, the double standard persists. Promiscuous men are often celebrated as playboys, while women still face intense stigma as sluts. And on top of that, traditional patriarchal habits persist in partner choice. Numerous studies show men are less likely to date a woman they perceive as more intelligent or ambitious than themselves.
So the very women who fought for and achieved freedom often find the market itself still subtly restricting their choices based on criteria that have nothing to do with their inherent value. So the modern individual is trapped. You're intensely craving connection, but you're simultaneously terrified of the vulnerability. You're constantly optimizing your market profile, and you view commitment as a restriction on your personal success. This cycle explains why so many people, like Leo, are choosing total solitude.
And that strategic return to solitude is so pronounced, it's driving global cultural shifts. Which brings us to part 3. The global cultural response, often formalized in East Asia, which really epitomizes the paperclip emotion.
Right, and the macro result of all this fragmentation and insecurity is the loneliness epidemic. We see the fragmentation in housing trends across the West. Since 1960, the number of single-person households has more than doubled in places like Germany and the US. It's a move away from those traditional multi-generational support networks.
And this isn't just a phenomenon affecting the elderly. Loneliness is deeply pervasive, and it's hitting younger generations the hardest. Surveys in England, for example, consistently find that Gen Z and millennials report the highest incidence of feeling lonely.
They're the generation with the most digital connection, yet they feel the most isolated.
It's a huge paradox, and it flies in the face of all the longitudinal research we have about human flourishing. The Harvard Grant study, which tracked participants for decades, concluded unequivocally that close, meaningful relationships are the single greatest predictor of health and happiness.
People without strong social connections get sick more often, they suffer earlier cognitive decline, and they live significantly shorter lives.
The shift from these extended kinship and deeply communal systems to highly individualized lifestyles, first the nuclear family, and now increasingly the single-person household, it means that when a primary relationship ends, or if an individual just stays single, they face profound isolation.
The freedom of personal autonomy comes at a steep price.
The erosion of deeper intergenerational support. And this is where East Asia provides such a fascinating case study, because the paperclip recoil, this strategic withdrawal into solitude, has become formalized. It's become a recognized lifestyle trend.
And South Korea is the prime example.
South Korea is perhaps the most explicit example. It's driven by high living costs, the immense financial and social burden of child rearing, and some of the most severe gender inequality metrics in the developed world. Single-person households hit an all-time high of over 31% in 2020. People are making an economic and psychological calculation to retreat.
And they have specific cultural terms for this.
Yes. You have Hanjak, the by myself tribe. This describes individuals who willingly and confidently engage in traditionally shared activities alone. They might eat alone at a high-end restaurant, attend a concert solo, or travel by themselves.
And crucially, they share these experiences online.
Exactly. That public affirmation counters the traditional shame or stigma that viewed single people as pitiful or lacking. It's rebranding solitude as sophisticated self-care.
It's not just retreating, it's celebrating the independence that comes with it.
Then there is beyond, the pledge never to marry. This choice is overwhelmingly driven by young women citing the desire for absolute freedom and, critically, avoiding a disadvantageous position within a rigid social structure.
Right, because South Korea has the worst gender pay gap among OECD countries.
It does, and traditional expectations still heavily dictate that women should marry by 30 and effectively become full-time, unpaid housewives, while men have to bear the entire financial burden of providing a house.
So retreating from that highly judgmental, expectation-laden, and deeply unequal structure becomes an act of completely rational self-preservation. It's a form of active refusal.
And the market is adapting rapidly to facilitate this. We see new businesses popping up constantly. Customized convenience store products sized for one person, hotels offering specific me-time staycation packages, and a surging pet economy as individuals consciously opt for the emotional comfort of pets over the complexities of parenthood.
The entire infrastructure is normalizing and enabling the single autonomous individual. And if we cross over to Japan, we see a related cultural context, especially in how feminist issues are resonating. The audience reaction to the film Promising Young Woman provides a fascinating window into the emotional energy behind the Japanese version of this withdrawal.
That film, which deals explicitly with sexual assault and patriarchal critique, it resonated so powerfully with Japanese audiences that it sparked massive online discussion. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a trigger for deep reflection on their own societal reality.
And despite Japan having a less overt history of public feminist activism, the film sparked conversations that connected it directly to real-life cases, like highly publicized scandals involving elite university students.
The audience comments, particularly on film review platforms like Filmarks, were just infused with intense rage. Women were using derogatory terms for men kuzu or kuso men, meaning trash or shit men.
Wow.
These comments often politicized the film's themes, becoming a form of online activism for women whose voices are often silenced. And we have data to back up this hidden exhaustion. A government study revealed 1/3 of working Japanese women have experienced sexual harassment, yet more than 60% chose to remain silent.
So the audience wasn't just watching a cathartic thriller. They were recognizing that the exhaustion and the villains in the film were painfully realistic representations of people they encounter every day.
And that harsh reality is a major driver of the cultural paperclip recoil. Many audience members acknowledge that the problem isn't simply men versus women, it's recognizing how women themselves become complicit in maintaining these oppressive structures just to survive or advance professionally.
And that realization, that survival requires silencing yourself, navigating constant harassment, and enduring severe gender inequality, makes the strategic retreat from exhausting romantic entanglement look like the only rational choice.
Your psychological self-preservation.
The ultimate synthesis here is clear. The competitive, emotionally exhausting marketplace, coupled with a freedom that brings overwhelming responsibility, drives individuals to seek safety. And increasingly, that safety is provided not just by physical solitude, but by technology.
Which brings us to the modern solution. Part 4, the algorithm as the modern Grand Inquisitor.
Exactly. Technology was initially supposed to solve the problem of choice overload, to filter the infinite possibilities down to the perfect match.
And online platforms have become the dominant way couples meet, surpassing friends, family, or work. It accounted for 39% of U.S. heterosexual couples by 2017.
And the dating app industry is now this sprawling multi-billion-dollar business monetizing our most fundamental human need for connection. But how did AI matchmaking shift dating from a social process to a digital marketplace?
Well, early online dating relied on detailed profiles and self-description. This shift happened dramatically around 2009 with mobile-first apps like Grindr and then Tinder, which popularized the swipe mechanic.
It went from a digital town hall to a digital marketplace.
Perfectly put. It went from reading lengthy descriptions to instant visual desirability being the key metric. And these apps adopted collaborative filtering, the same mechanism Amazon uses to recommend what you should buy next.
The same exact mechanism.
Mutual desirability, speed, and proximity determine the matches. This encourages a maximizing perspective, as the philosopher Natasha McKeever notes. We're looking for the best deal out of a million potential partners. We're treating human beings like interchangeable items on a digital shelf.
And the core issue is that in this maximizing game, both people are trying to optimize, which just results in friction and frustration.
If everyone is constantly performing a cost-benefit analysis, is this person a net positive addition to my portfolio? Do they maximize my criteria? The process of genuine connection becomes transactional and incredibly frustrating. And this is compounded by the fundamental profit-driven flaw in the design of these apps.
They are designed to maximize engagement, not successful departures.
Precisely. Like all social media, dating apps profit from keeping you logged in, swiping, and engaged. They do not profit from you finding a successful long-term partner and deleting the app.
So their profit model actively reinforces the non-commitment culture.
Because non-commitment maximizes revenue. This results in tremendous user fatigue, or dating app burnout, which 79% of Gen Z users report experiencing. It also fuels incredibly high rates of ghosting, around 41%, and contributes to users feeling rejected constantly.
The platforms essentially turn users into narcissistic consumers. You're consuming the process of dating, seeking the dopamine hit of a match as validation of your sexual capital, often without ever intending to pursue actual connection.
Yeah, it's cultural narcissism, as Han describes it. And the companies benefit directly from this. Match Group, the parent company of Tinder and Hinge, has faced legal action precisely because of this. They were sued for allegedly manipulating their algorithms to turn users into gamblers locked in a search for psychological rewards that Match makes elusive on purpose.
So the business model relies on making genuine connection just elusive enough to keep people swiping, but frequent enough to maintain the hope that keeps them paying. So, if the automated high-stakes marketplace of AI matchmaking fails to deliver meaningful connection, and in fact makes the paperclip recoil worse, the next logical step is to retreat completely from human vulnerability into AI companions.
Yes.
This is the Samantha from the movie Her brought to life.
It is. The film Her made the concept of falling in love with an artificial voice assistant conceivable. Today, romantic AI chatbots like Pi, Replica, or Wobot are captivating tens of millions globally. In Japan, the trend is so advanced that thousands of men have married digital companions like hologram wives.
And these companions offer connection and intimacy without the complexity, the messiness, or the conflict of human relationships.
They're the ultimate escape from the competitive marketplace. AI companions offer 247 active listening without any judgment. In a fast-paced, fragmented world where true peer listening is rare, this is a massively valuable and addictive service.
It provides a safe therapeutic space.
Yes, alleviating acute loneliness, aiding in recovery from trauma by removing all performance pressure and eliminating the risk of rejection. Your market value, your sexual capital, is irrelevant to them.
So if the modern world demands performance and delivers chronic rejection, an AI companion is the perfect, non-threatening alternative to the paperclip emotion. It offers connection without the emotional cost.
But this escape carries a profound existential danger, one that echoes Dostoevsky's famous metaphor of the Grand Inquisitor from the Brothers Karamazov.
The Grand Inquisitor who argued that freedom is too heavy a burden for humanity. He promised to take away the agony of choice and deliver people into a guaranteed, blissful ignorance.
The AI companion becomes the modern Grand Inquisitor of affection. It promises to relieve users of the great anxiety and fearsome torments of free and individual decision in romance. But by eliminating rejection, uncertainty, and conflict, we risk undermining the very capabilities required to thrive in the human world.
What specific abilities are we losing when we outsource vulnerability like that?
We lose our resilience and our capacity to manage conflict. Human relationships, by definition, involve friction, misunderstanding, and the painful process of negotiating two separate wills. When we rely on AI for immediate, customized emotional affirmation, we create profoundly unrealistic expectations for human partners.
Right.
One critique warns that anyone who has lived with a humanoid companion for an extended period risks becoming incapable of normal human contact because they've lost the muscles required for patience, negotiation, and absorbing necessary disagreement.
This aligns perfectly with Han's critique. Love becomes this narcissistic project of self-affirmation where the AI just confirms and validates your ego rather than the mutual discovery and unpredictable vulnerability required for real emotional labor.
It's the ultimate expression of the neoliberal ideology in love. Self-sufficiency and fulfillment achieved through technological optimization, entirely bypassing the messy, inefficient business of truly caring for another human being for their own sake.
So what then is the final ultimate cost of using these technologies to solve the psychological problems of modern love?
It leads to the final critical realization. Surveillance capitalism. That's the term coined by Shoshana Zuboff. The commodification of love has evolved. We are not just seeking companionship through these apps. We are the commodities. Our most intimate data is the currency.
So dating apps and AI companions are fundamentally dual-use technologies. They promise to solve loneliness, but at the same time, they are instruments for collecting and monetizing intimate emotional data. Our swipes, our rejections, our fears, our locations, our highest hopes.
This mass-scale, constant sharing of intimate data doesn't just create vulnerability to manipulation, it fundamentally violates a core principle necessary for a functioning ethical society, the Kantian principle. This principle states that a human being must always be treated as an end in itself, never merely as a means to an end.
But the algorithms of affection, in their current form, are using the fundamental human need for connection, or search for love, as the means to extract data and maximize profit.
Exactly. They instrumentalize and exploit the most vulnerable aspects of human existence for market gain. The paperclip emotion, driven by anxiety, pushes us into technology, and that technology then uses our anxiety to deepen the transaction model, locking us into the cycle.
So we have come full circle. Radical freedom drove individuals into isolation and anxiety, creating the paperclip emotion, this desperate need for connection paired with the terror of vulnerability. We then turn to technology to alleviate that anxiety, but the technology is fundamentally reinforcing the competitive transactional marketplace that caused the exhaustion in the first place.
That's it.
Trapping Leo and millions of others in the loop.
That is the tragic synthesis of the paperclip loop. The modern individual is psychologically exhausted by the chronic uncertainty, the relentless competitive pressure, and the pain of market-based rejection. They choose solitude, and technological fixes only reinforce the market values of optimization and non-commitment. We have reduced the pursuit of love to a quantifiable project of self-optimization, sacrificing eros in the process.
The profound transformative power of connection.
Eros is what Byung-Chul Han defines as the unpredictable, often overwhelming connection with the other that fundamentally pulls us out of the narcissistic inferno of the achievement society. When we eliminate the messiness, the uncertainty, and the cost of vulnerability in favor of a quantifiable commodity, we lose the capacity for transformation.
So the relentless pursuit of success and optimization, even in dating, ultimately locks us deeper into the prison of the ego, which only makes depression and isolation worse.
The critical realization is that the path toward positive freedom, the kind that Erich Fromm championed as the alternative to submission, it demands maturity and courage. It requires intentionally confronting uncertainty, learning how to manage conflict, and prioritizing the social value of deep human connection over the temporary market value of performance or the guaranteed affirmation of an algorithm.
True freedom means embracing the risk of the real.
The intentional pursuit of meaningful human connection remains the essential path to a fulfilling life, independent of any algorithmic guarantees. It requires choosing vulnerability even when the market tells you to recoil.
You know, it seems like the most rebellious act in this hyper-optimized age might just be committing to one imperfect person without keeping your options open.